check the PM playlist, and I'll have today's date on it. PM, 1 Peter 3. Sunday PM playlist over on the left. It's not loaded there? Well, it should be in the sermons folder. You can drag it in there. If you get it worked out, we'll go with it. I just have the outlines there. Thought I had it ready to go. My apologies. All right. Comedian Nate Bargatze, one of the biggest comedians right now, and thankfully very clean and respectful. And he often pokes fun at himself, even his wife too, for how they fight. And one of the ones that we've seen lately is how he said they got into a fight over the phrase, one fell swoop. He said that when it came time for Christmas visits, his wife's family, her parents are divorced, and so they have to, they make 2 different trips at each holiday to see both parents. And so she told him, Nate, I want to go see my parents in just one fell swoop. And he says, great, I'm all on board, sounds great. So then she followed up and said, so I want to go see my dad, then come back home and repack, and then go back and see my mom. And he began to think, what's she talking about? And so he says, what's the one fell swoop part about then? And so she said, yeah, one fell swoop. I want to go to my dad's, then go home, then go to my mom's. And he finally just said, well, babe, that's not what that means. And she got mad at him and didn't talk for the rest of the day. And then the next morning, she kind of snuggled up against him and kind of seemed to be an apology. And so he said, you know that's not what that means, right? He couldn't resist. He thought it was worth kind of picking a fight over or maintaining a boundary over, right? We understand that we go through life and there are convictions we have, and that there are convictions that we must stand up for, even in the face of opposition and disagreement. We're all faced with those decisions. We must know what we hold closely as our guiding convictions in all things. It will always be a challenge to live out fully what we believe and what our convictions are. It's easy to have some beliefs that perhaps we hide and reveal when it's convenient, but hide when it's not convenient to own up to them. Howard Hendricks is credited with saying, a belief is something you'd argue about, while a conviction is something you would die for. You might believe something and argue vehemently about it, but when it comes time to pay with suffering and even your life, you wouldn't do it. And so we find out our true convictions when they are met with true opposition. That's what Peter's going to address in this part of the book in 1 Peter chapter 3. To set the stage fully for his point, I think it's powerful to consider an example from a Russian professor, but also an author who faced opposition for just simply believing the truth and speaking the truth. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is one of the kind of main thinkers from the 90s, the mid to late 90s era of Russia. He was a professor, but he was arrested and sent to these work camps called gulags because he was outspoken against the efforts of Stalin and other communist leaders. And the day he was arrested, he knew it was coming, so the day he was arrested, he released an essay simply titled, Live Not by Lies. That's a key theme of his because he understood that this movement, this communism movement, is built on falsehood. And if you live by those falsehoods, if you give into those falsehoods, then you will suffer and you perpetrate suffering throughout. So he simply said, live not by lies. When he got out of these work camps, he was there for about 8 years, he released a novella that technically was fiction, but it was based on his experiences. And it was simply a single day in the life of a person in one of these work camps. And the guy gets to his work assignment out in the field, and it's to build something with bricks. And so he spends some time talking about what it's like to build with these bricks. And as the sun begins to set, and all the other workers begin to leave, he realizes he's not yet finished. He's taking his time being more particular and precise. And even though he's being asked to build for, quote, the enemy, the state who's arrested him, he takes pride in his work. And so he lays every brick as straight as he can. and he finishes his job before he leaves for the day. He's later than all the rest. In the back of his mind, he's a little concerned. Will that be a costly, risky decision? Because if I get back to camp later, then I'm in the back of the food line. I may not get food. I may get broth only. And now I'm falling behind because I tried to do the right thing. But he still stays. He finishes up the job. It's clean and straight. It's the best built brick in the whole camp. He gets back in the food line and he's prepared himself for the worst. He hands over his bowl. He gets the bowl back. He sees that it's got broth in it, but he also notices there's a whole entire potato in his soup. So he goes back and he's able to eat the broth and eat the potato and be well nourished. And so the final closing scene is him in bed saying he smiled as he stretched his arms behind his head. He had had a good day. He's in a work camp. He's being mistreated. He's facing opposition for speaking the truth. And he's also able to have a, quote, good day. Because he worked hard, he worked with excellence, he didn't sacrifice or compromise work ethic. Someone was looking out for him and gave him a potato. Now he's able to sleep and rest with a full stomach. And sleep with a good conscience. There will be plenty of times as we live out our faith that the more opposition grows, we're going to have to decide, am I going to live with a good conscience based on truth and faith? Or will I allow myself to give in because of the opposition that I do face? How will we respond? I want us to just quickly notice a couple of things about the text we're skipping over. All right, so 2 weeks ago we talked from chapter 2 about our relationship with the government. The next section in the text of chapter 2 talks about submission in, quote, maybe what we think about today is the workplace. Bondservants and masters. And you have especially some bondservants who have masters who are cruel. How will you live in that environment? And Peter says, you still must show them honor and respect for being your master. And it's in that submission that you're able to glorify God. And then the next section after he talks about Jesus, at the end of that one, in chapter 3, verse 1, he opens talking about wives to their husbands and then husbands to their wives. Now, submission is a guiding principle there. And we would do well that the more opposition grows, the more secular our culture becomes, we must see both of those arenas of life, the workplace and the home/marriage. Those are very real, quote, battlegrounds that a secular culture would love to keep attacking and to undermine. Those are very real institutions that God has given us to be a part of, to make a difference within. And it's in those environments that we keep holding up and honoring, and in the case of our text tonight, elevating Christ in those environments to make a great difference for the Lord. All right, let's dive into chapter 3, verse 13. There are other places in this letter where Peter's eye is on making a difference, influencing, having them to glorify God. But here, the emphasis is on no matter how they respond, that there's going to be a level and a point at which they mistreat you, and they're not going to be won over by your good efforts. But you still keep your eyes on Christ no matter what. So verse 13. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what's good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that's in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it's better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. If we could summarize that whole text maybe in one sentence, it's the idea that we cannot be harmed even when we suffer. We cannot be harmed even when we suffer from opposition, because it's God who keeps blessing us. In order to make this point, he's going to only have one true imperative. There are some other constructions that function as commands, but this is the only true command, and it's the one that we've titled the lesson tonight. It's found in verse number 15. Honor Christ the Lord as holy. Your relationship to your opposition is not the most important relationship in this discussion. It's your relationship to the Lord. So when you recognize there will be opposition, when you recognize that it's growing in a time around you, we still cannot let our focus be upon those who would mistreat us, but instead our focus continues to be and must always be on honoring and elevating Christ above all. Someone said, unless we sanctify or honor the Lord in our hearts, we will then be afraid of what man might do, or be troubled by what he threatens us with. See, until we are rightly fearing, respecting Christ and God, then only will we have the appropriate strength to overcome any fear from outside mistreatment. A couple of things that accompany this main command now. Number one, be enthusiastic for the right things. Who is to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? Zealous is an interesting New Testament word because it's really the same word, whether it's used about wrath or good things. It's an enthusiasm that boils over. Well, here it's for good. It's zealous for righteousness. No one can harm you if you're outwardly and inwardly enthusiastic about the will of the Lord, doing the right things, focusing on the right things. So that's pulling back in this concept of how important truth is. Live not by lies. Don't buy the culture's lies. You live by the truth that comes from God, and you find truth in any arena. Anywhere you see truth that aligns with the truth of God, you also acknowledge it, because truth is truth. It's important to notice this command and this idea. The more we live in an attention-seeking economy. Yes, we're living in a culture that's largely secularized, and accompanying that is a desire to seek attention for ourselves. That's the only way these social media algorithms keep working, is we want to be seen. We want to be known. We want to be boosted. And so we go about seeking attention. But over and over again, we're told in the New Testament, when you seek what the Lord wants you to seek, when you let your attention be focused on Him, He gives you all of the reward. He gives you all of the comfort and acceptance that you need. You don't go about seeking attention from others. You go about seeking to give the attention to God. And so we would do well to keep coming back to this idea of, am I paying attention to what is right and true and good, as opposed to trying to seek the attention of other people. Peter later, in the second letter that he writes, 2 Peter chapter 1, he talks about this paying attention directly in connection to the Word of God. 2 Peter 1, verse 19, we have the prophetic word more fully confirmed. That's more confirmed than his experience at the Mount of Transfiguration. So we have this prophetic word more fully confirmed, to which you would do well to pay attention, as to a lamp shining in a dark place, until the day dawns, the morning star rises in your hearts, until the Lord comes back. This is your guiding light. If you're in a dark place and you have a flashlight, you would pay extra careful attention to it, because it's the source of your safety. It's the source of your deliverance. Well, you must now have that same enthusiasm toward the standard of truth, the Word of God, to guide you. Jordan Peterson is kind of one of the more modern, maybe philosophical minds in our current era, and I don't know a lot about him or a lot about what he teaches, but one of the things I ran across with him was he asked the question, how do you live without worrying about what other people think about you? And it's a maturing principle to kind of have to reason through. And he used as an example an interview he did over in Great Britain, and he said it was a great pre-interview. They were very kind and welcoming and all of this. And then, boom, once the lights turned on and she started asking questions, she just tried to hammer him up against the wall. And he said it was amazing, just in the after results of that sometimes the viral aspect of it was that he was lauded as doing good and saying good, and then sometimes the opposition was, hey, she did great, and now she's being mistreated or whatever else. And he said, I didn't have to worry about what was being said about that interview. He said, because I decided a while back that I would only say what was true. And so if people are upset at me or upset about what I said, that's not on me because I decided I would say what's true. And so here he has kind of endured a lot of persecution, quote, for lack of a better word, from some of his principles because they hurt people's feelings when it's true. But his principle, isolating that when I can speak truth and know truth, and I am enthusiastic, I'm zealous for what is good, that keeps me from having to worry about who I'm pleasing. I'm on the side of truth, and I'm simply discovering truth from God and His Word and repeating and telling others the truth along the way. That does set up this next idea, verse 15, that there is a moment and an expectation even for engaging with our opposition. You know, the context of this passage is about those who are actively mistreating us, maybe even those from a position above us of power who are persecuting us. And so while we might commonly associate verse 15 with people's religious questions at work or from family, and maybe it has an aspect of application there, his dominant emphasis here is when a Roman soldier asks you, why do you have this as your hope? And you might be arrested, or you might be sent off somewhere into exile, or you might be killed. How have you prepared yourself? When someone who doesn't have the hope you have asks you, why do you have this staunch hope? You be prepared to give them an answer. So he's telling us, you be ready for an engagement. That means it's not an alternative. It's not a choice to be able to say, oh, I'm just not going to engage. When truth is in view, when the gospel of Jesus Christ is on the line, when others can come to see the love that He has for all the world, that's not the time to be silent. So when you're in an opportunity to be engaged, you engage them. You give them an answer that you've been preparing in your hearts with that truth, so that you can then give that to them and help them to see and to know the God behind it all. We must use words, and we must not only give thought to the words we say, but also how we say them. And that's the next clause in this verse, isn't it? Yet do it. Isn't that interesting that Peter emphasizes yet? He knew it would be a temptation. Okay, well, I have to say something, so that means that no matter how I say it, it needs to be said. No, Peter says you need to be prepared with the truth and be prepared with how you say it. The two aspects are meekness or gentleness and fear or respect. So thinking about what we talked about last month with gentleness, that concept is power or strength that's been brought under appropriate control. You've thought about this most powerful thing you can communicate, your hope in the gospel. But instead of viewing it and treating like a weapon that you use against someone, you view it and you harness it so that its message is clear. You let it do whatever it's going to do on that heart. But it's not your job to be a bully with it. It's your job to be as clear and uncompromising, unflinching with it along the way. But also be fearful, reverent, respectful, not having an attitude of arrogance or being flippant. Some have even suggested that perhaps there's a bit of a twofold examination here, that with gentleness, that's taking into account the other person you're answering to, whereas fear or respect has to do with being reverent toward God. Maybe that's in view. That Peter is saying you don't ever forget God in this equation, but you take into account this other person's life and soul. I think as we think about how important this engagement is, look at Paul and look at Jesus both and how they endured their trials. They were mistreated, they were accused. Sometimes those accusations were patently false. Sometimes they called them out on those accusations because they were not true. Yet they always did it with a meek spirit, and they always did it with the respect for the people who were making those accusations. So think ahead, look at how they handled those situations so that when we are faced with them, we can say we've prayerfully prepared for such a times as these. The more anger and division become common around us, the more we understand that gentleness will stand out. The more we understand that respectfulness and reverence will stand out in the midst of an angry culture. But third, we see the need for exercising good conduct. Before we can stand before men without fear, someone said, we must be able to stand before God without fear. We're doing what's right. We're living what's right daily. Therefore, we know that we're right before God. And that also gives us confidence then before those who are around us and even those who are mistreating us. So verse 16, having a good conscience so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. It's better to suffer for doing good. When we do good, we might suffer. But God blesses the doing of good even when it leads to suffering. We're always in control of our choices, our decisions, and every godly, ethical decision is constantly building a defense in the eyes of those who are against us. I think it's important we notice that this is a dominant theme, if not the dominant theme of Peter's in this entire letter. That you take into account and you ensure that every day and every minute of every day, you're simply living as you ought to live. That is key to any response you have in the midst of a culture that's turned against you. So you go back to chapter 2, verse 12, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. So this speaks to the influence, similar to Matthew 5 and verse 16, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Earlier in chapter 3, verse 8, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, a humble mind. That's internal aspects. How does that look in action? Verse 9, do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. This you recall, that you may obtain a blessing. See, there's a specific action in view. You don't pay back evil for evil. When someone speaks against you in a harsh way, you don't return that to them. That's good conduct in the eyes of the Lord. Chapter 4, verse 3, the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drunken parties, lawless idolatry. You've put that behind you. They haven't. But your conduct has changed. The time has passed because you've made a change. You've obeyed the gospel. You've died to all of that. And then finally, 4 verses 8 and 9. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. There is a sense in which we must have a prepared, quote, apologetic, a defense for when we're asked why we believe what we believe. But we also must not miss the important role that active love, good conduct in the Lord, plays in all of this. That in some respects, love is the most powerful, impacting apologetic we can give to the world. We have a prepared answer, but we also have prepared actions of loving and serving their needs. And so it's this concept of good conduct that bridges the gap to a phrase that's in verse number 16, the beginning part, that begins, it's going to be our final point, this idea of a good conscience. Why was the gentleman in the novel able to go to bed with a good conscience? Because he could have used his mistreatment as an excuse to not do right. But instead, he still always did what was right so he could pillow his head with a good conscience. That's exactly what Peter is saying. Peter is saying, you have a good conscience. Why? Because you've always lived with good conduct. A few months ago, Hazel read a novel that was historical fiction. It's set on the Titanic. The Titanic parts are real and accurate, but the story that happens on it is just made up by an author. And it's a young teenage girl, and she goes to the Titanic wanting to buy a ticket, prepared with money to buy a ticket. But she gets there, and she's a few cents short. She cannot afford it. So she kind of exercises some ingenuity, and she sneaks her way on to the Titanic as a stowaway. Well, as she's maneuvering about the boat and doing some research, she's wanting to be a writer. She has a bag that has all of her valuables and her notebook in it, and it gets stolen. And so she says, I could not report to the authorities that my bag was stolen because I had stolen my way onto the Titanic. Peter's saying the same thing. The Lord's telling us the same thing. If you sacrifice your good conduct, If you sacrifice your righteous living in the midst of a culture that's turned against you, you have no basis now to be able to tell them that they're missing the will of God. You have no basis to be able to have a good conscience in all things. So point number 4 is we need to exercise. We get to enjoy a good conscience. When we elevate Christ in our hearts and we do these things, we don't ever sacrifice them. The payoff is that we get to, quote, have a good conscience. We're able to sleep at night with a clear mind, able to know deep down that the others are wrong and that others will see a public display of their treatment. When that happens, you're enjoying the blessing of God. And it only happens as long as we maintain these things He's telling us. As long as you're zealous about that which is good, and you're not zealous about that which is evil. As long as you're not unprepared, or as long as you don't overreact to those who ask you about your hope. As long as you live without compromising your ethical daily standards, then you can live with a good conscience, and will live with a good conscience. Jesus connects this blessing and persecution often in His own teaching, you remember? Matthew chapter 5, beginning of verse 10, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The people who are able to maintain their convictions, even in the face of persecution, those are the people you associate the kingdom with. Those are true kingdom-minded people. He continues, verse 11, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely," lack of truth, "on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." You have good company when you suffer for speaking truth and remaining faithful to God. You also have that future reward of a future hope in heaven with Him. You'll notice that's an important theme of Peter. Peter says you fix your hope on the Lord's return when you go get to be with Him to inherit that great inheritance set aside for you. Well, Jesus says the same thing. You may miss out on the earthly, quote, reward of praise and acceptance by man, but you've been given a far greater reward from God in heaven. Romans 8 paints this courtroom-type image, and the opening question of this barrage of questions is, what then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Because of what all God has done to save you and to help strengthen you while you're saved. Here's the question. Who can be against you? No one can, because God is always for you. John would have a similar reminder, 1 John 4 and verse 4. "Little children, you are from God and have overcome them, the Antichrist, the false teachers. For he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world." That's the foundation of having a good conscience, of knowing that my righteousness and my faithfulness is grounded in Jesus Christ, in His truth. He matters most of all. The opinions of others don't matter. The acceptance of others don't matter. The treatment by authorities and government figures doesn't directly matter. What matters most is how much I'm loved by God, and thus how much I love Him and remain faithful to Him in the midst of any circumstances. As we close, I want you to notice verse number 18. It continues to be part of his argument. Because Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous. It's substitutionary suffering, that He might bring us to God. Well, how does that bringing us to God look like? When does it happen? You just keep reading the verses that follow. Look at verse 20. When God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you. Not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The basis for the good conscience we get to enjoy even in the midst of mistreatment, it starts when we have a good conscience before God, knowing I've done everything He's told me to do. I've submitted to the clear command And I enjoy the blessing of forgiveness and salvation, made possible through the death and resurrection of Jesus, and now made available through the waters of baptism for the forgiveness of sins. And so it's a true statement to say that if I am still outside of Christ, I don't possess what I need in order to have a good conscience in a culture of mistreatment. The most important decision I must make is, will I obey Jesus Christ? If you need to make that decision this afternoon, we would love to help you make that decision, to study with you, to talk with you about that, walk through the Scriptures to see the will of God. If we can help you, please let us know today. If you've stepped out of that standard, if you've walked away from the truth, you've not been living in it, you've compromised the truth, you can come back to Him and come back to Him this afternoon. You don't have to pillow your head tonight being concerned about your relationship to God. Would you come, and would you come now as we sing together?